Hello friends, Dr. McCarthy here from South Seattle College and Kaplan University. Today we're going to talk about the elements of a good academic paper, and what I'm going to walk you through can be applied to just about any type of academic paper, but keep in mind that what I'm going to discuss today more specifically is an argument paper. That is when you take a stance and you work to defend it. So I'm going to look at a couple things. First, I'm going to go over this outline process that I use. You don't have to use the same outline process, but I find that it really helps a great deal in organizing my papers. So I'm going to show you what I do when I write papers. And I'm going to go between there and this article that I wrote several years ago now. Called Improvisational Dramatism. And both of these documents will be available to you. You'll be able to see how I kind of apply what I'm going to show you on the outline process, okay? So let's start with the introduction. Of course, the first thing you have to do is remember to put all your papers in the format that's required by your instructor. Some schools and disciplines are going to require you to do APA form, and some will do MLA, and some is Chicago, and then there are forms specific to sociology, psychology, the sciences, so on and so forth. So you need to know what kind of paper, what format of your paper that you need to put your paper in. And the format is not only the format like you need, for example, a title page that is separate from the beginning of your paper, to considerations of how you cite the information you include. So make sure you are clear about what is being asked of you there. Now, when we start our papers, the first thing you want to do is you want to include a working title for your paper. In my case, we are looking at my paper called Improvisational Dramatism. And there we go. So that we have a working title. I call it a working title because as your paper develops and as you better develop your argument, there's a good chance that your title will develop. But never do things like this: final, English 102. This is not a good title. Unit 2 paper. That is not a good title. A title in general will describe what your paper is about in a very succinct way, okay? Improvisational dramatism. Next, we're going to look at the different elements that we need to have in our introduction. Now, I have boiled down my introduction to include the following elements that I think can be very helpful. First is the hook. The hook is basically a way to get your audience interested. And I'll put that down there. How will you get all right, so you want to, it's audience specific. So a hook, for example, of for an academic audience might be something very academic, like what I have in this journal article here. My hook is this: social movements that utilize comical, theatrical, and carnivalesque modes of protest often run the risk of their theatrics blurring their intended message. Now, in my world of academics, when I was in the process of getting my PhD, there was a great deal of talk about how different protest groups around the world were utilizing different modes of protest. So this was a big deal in my world at the time that I wrote this paper, and so I knew that this would be a hook. This would be something that might catch somebody's attention. Now, if you are writing for a different audience, say for example your Facebook friends, you're going to change the way you have your hook. You're going to maybe put a crazy video on Facebook and you're going to say, hey, check out these really weird people protesting downtown. I think they've got something going for them, or something like that, right? It's going to be more formal, and it's probably going to be a little bit more sensational. For you, you're going to be writing for me, and also there's a good chance you're going to be writing for your classmates, depending on what class of mine you're going to be in. So although you're going to write for me, I also want you to think about your invisible or intended audience. That in the best of all possible worlds, who would you want reading this paper? Not only is it your professor, but who could you really aim this paper to? My ideal intended audience is social movement groups. And I'm going to say that right here in my outline because I want to remind myself over and over again. I hit the wrong key. Sorry about that. I want to remind myself over and over again that my intended audience are social movement groups, okay? But you can also add, and my professor. So it's good to know and remember who your audience is going to be. And then you want to know what your hook is going to be. My hook about how theatrical All right. So I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I'm identifying it, right? So I'm reminding myself who my intended audience is, and I'm identifying how I'm going to write my hook. Okay, so that's one of the first things. The next thing is your thesis statement. A thesis statement is especially for short papers, okay, one sentence long, and you're saying what you are arguing and why. Now let me go over here. My thesis statement is the second thing here in this paper. In order to aid social movements in their efforts regarding performance protest, this essay proposes a unified rhetorical protest paradigm designed to create direct theatrical moments of incongruity, improvisational dramatism. And then what I do is I go on to explain it. But this is my thesis. It's not entirely explained, but I'm basically telling you what I am doing and why. All right, so what I am doing is I'm going to aid social movements by giving them a new technique in order to protest, improvisational dramatism. So this here, we'll say, is my thesis. And so in my outline, I want to put that down, right? Oops. And it didn't work really well, but we'll write the thesis down. Okay, so we have an idea what my thesis is, okay, and so that's set. Now I need to give background information, and background information basically is just that extra bits of information that your reader might need in order to understand what he or she is going to be introduced to. Let's go back to my paper here. My background information explains some information about what this is, improvisational dramatism, and it also starts to explain why we need it. And I look at a couple different groups. So let's look at this. ID, which is improvisational dramatism, and you see what I did here. I introduced the concept, and then I tell my reader that I'm going to use a short verbiage for that concept right afterwards. Improvisational dramatism, parentheses, capital I, capital D, and parentheses. So I'm saying that this here, whenever I use this, that means improvisational dramatism. And once I present it this way, I could use the acronym all through my paper. So I say ID combines Kenneth Burke's theory on dramatism with commedia and improvisational techniques. This heuristic method rests on the philosophy of rhetorical pragmatism, which guides the communication paradigm. ID will be explored while examining protests performed by two social justice movements, Reverend Billy's Church to Stop Shopping and Act Up. So this kind of gives you some background information. I explain what ID is, or improvisational dramatism. I explain that it rests on an earlier theory by Kenneth Burke called dramatism, but I'm going to combine his theory with theatrical elements in commedia and also improvisational techniques in order to direct the improvisational process. And then I'm going to say that it also rests on this idea of pragmatism, what is called rhetorical pragmatism. So I'm telling my reader, who by the way was an academic audience, that I'm combining communication theory, I'm going to combine theater theory, and I'm also going to combine philosophy in order to give a complete way for people to better protest, okay? And again, remember, I'm writing this way because this is for a very particular audience. I was going to give this paper at an academic conference, and so I needed to address that audience with specific language. Now, because this is a 27-page paper, you can see that my background information is a lot. I talk about the early protests going on in 1966. I talk about the theatrical protests of ACT UP, so I give this kind of history as to how social movement groups have been using theater and theatrical protest techniques for years in order to get their message across. So I'm giving the reader a history. Listen, this has been going on since at least 1966, and there's been important things all the way up to 1999 in Seattle with the WT protest. I'm saying that these people are using theatrical ways to protest already. However, there's a problem, and I start to explain what those problems are. And then I use some research to back that up. All right, and I talk about why the problems exist. So this is all background information. So I'm going into my second paragraph, but this is still my introduction. So I tell about why problems exist here as well. Okay, and then I end this all by saying why we need my theory again. Now remember, this is a lot for an introduction, but I am dealing with a paper that is, 27 pages long. Yours will be incredibly shorter. It will probably be 1, maybe 2 paragraphs at the most, okay? So I follow this up with why my theory is needed, but the last element I include in my introduction, and let's go back to this, is how my paper is going to be organized, okay? And we put this in there. It's a general roadblock for our readers, letting our readers know how we're going to prove our argument. And it's important because, when you go on a road trip, although it's fun just to jump in the car and drive, the truth is having a map is helpful. And this is the same for our audiences or for our readers. They need a map to know where they are starting out and how they are going to get to the end point. And that's what you're including in this, okay? So let's go back to my paper. I say that why ID is important, and then I explain how I'm going to organize my paper to prove this, and that's in this section right here. First, while examining Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping direct cell phone opera protest, I will demonstrate the need to revive interpersonal relations in regard to the promotion of social justice and the role that rhetorical pragmatism can play in accomplishing this task. In the second part of this essay, while exploring ACT UP, Stop the Church Direct Action, I will examine Burke's use of dramatism and how dramatism can be adjusted with the aid of improvisational commedia techniques to accommodate a praxis-oriented communication method that helps create directed acts of theatrical incongruity. Now, what's interesting here is what I'm doing is using a lot of language that is going to be important to my audience, okay? If I was going to communicate to you, this paper was written for you, my students, I might say, first we're going to look at this protest by Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping. They had a great protest called the Cell Phone Opera, and I'm going to show you how they were able to use this particular protest to make sure that they had good relations with the customers already in the store, and how at the same time they were able to promote social justice and also reject the shopping paradigm. And then I'm going to say in the second essay, where we look at ACT UP, Stop the Church Direct Action, I'm going to show how using dramatic elements and theatrical elements could be brought together in order to make people stop and think. That's theatrical incongruity. So I'm using different languages, right? But I'm saying the same thing. So when you write, you have to remember who your audience is and how you're going to present the idea. Because I was writing for a bunch of communication scholars, I used the word praxis, I used oriented communication, I used the word incongruity. These are all words that my fellow communication theorists like to use. I use kairos, prepon. I used all of these terms, but remember, these terms are audience specific, so keep that in mind. That's the end of this first video. My second video will go over the body of your paper, so stay tuned. Thank you and mahalo.